most Christians refuse to be broken. Most Christians refuse to be broken. So we'll find it difficult to get to that point where our minds are transformed into thinking like God thinks. It's just, if you look at the stuff we've taught over the past few months, relationships, for example. What we think of relationships is very different to what God thinks of relationships. What we think of a lot of things is very different to what God thinks of a lot of things. And until we get to that point where God transforms our thinking. Because how many of you here actually, not about you doing it, but actually think about laying hands on the sick and seeing them healed? So about a quarter, if that, maybe a fifth of us. And the point is that every single one of us, even if you are not walking in it, should have it at the bottom of your mind that this is where I'm heading to. Because if you don't even have it as a goal, it's never going to happen. Even for those of us that have it as a goal, it's going to take a lot before we see it manifest. Again, how many of us want to prosper? I would suggest every single one of us wants to prosper. How many of us are taking steps to walk in prosperity? Again, probably not as many as want to. How many of you, and don't accept this as being boastful if you say yes, how many of you would like to be powerful preachers of the word? To stand up and speak and people are just like, wow. Quite a few of us. And of that quite a few, how many of you are living the Bible now? A couple of us. Right, a couple of you. So the reality is that if we're going to be what God has called us to be, it starts, and even that's all, it starts with us having our minds renewed and beginning to think like.
You can be a shepherd and you can be an evangelist. It doesn't have to be one thing. It all kind of fits in together. So it's a delicate topic, and I think we really need to be in tune with God to understand which roles He wants us to play. Because if you do more than one, you can.
Okay. Go ahead, Mike, yeah?
No, I was just thinking of something. It's not, I'm just sharing ideas. Basically, there's a rapper, American rapper, and he does Christian rap, but basically, when he did decide to give his life to Christ, there was a song about it, like they were trying to take him into the church, dress him up nicely, because obviously he did all this weed, all this rubbish stuff or whatever, that obviously wasn't Christian like. But obviously he now, fair enough, he went to church. Maybe they tried to, in the song they're trying to describe it as in like they tried to dress him up or make him look like he's a good person, but it's not all about appearance. And obviously his sort of what he felt comfortable in was like, he does music and it's something he knows he's good at, but he's not just going to go to church and then stay at church, dress up in suit and then look like a changed person. But he realized that maybe his calling from God was to continue doing what he's doing, but doing it in a way that glorifies God. So the people that listen to his music already, fair enough, someone else that listens to maybe gospel music might not listen to his music at all. But some people like that live in the streets or whatever in America or rap about all this rubbish or whatever might listen to him because of the way he raps, and he's just changing the lyrics. Sometimes he's purposely putting lyrics, like in one of his tracks, he actually starts off as if he's one of these hood people, and then he goes, oh, finally I've got these people listening, and then he starts talking about what he actually wants to talk about, God's will and all that stuff and all that whatever. But it was like he realized that he doesn't have to become and just go to church and then dress up or do everything what people portray as going to church does, but he can still do what he does, but do it the way that glorifies God.
And even to add to that, like, it really does go beyond what we presume like the will of God is, because I know, well, I used to know two people that worked in really, really good companies, and they really wanted to go higher and higher in the finance industry and stuff like that. But then God actually called them to go to places like China, go to places like India, where they can't even know Christ, they can't even read their Bibles because there's so many sanctions and there's so many, restrictions to, being a Christian. They were called to go there, leave their jobs, leave their family, and actually go there and preach the gospel. That's what their was. That's what God with them was. So it's like it's beyond that, and it's like, do we actually want the will of God to happen? Because if God said to you, do you know what, scrap your education, scrap everything, and go to places that you would never ever think of going before and do my will there, you would be actually do that. So it's a bit difficult.
Okay, before I kind of do this, if God called you to do something you didn't like, would you do it? So for instance, if God called you to be a preacher, but you didn't like talking in public, would you do it? If God called you, as in this case, to go to Afghanistan, to preach the gospel, would you go? Eventually. Okay. I guess what I'm trying to bring up here is sometimes I don't know. I don't think I don't take this as gospel. I think most times God calls you to do something. You're probably going to resist it initially. Especially if God really calls you to something. Initially you're going to resist it because you're going to look at what God has called you to do and think you can't do it. If God calls you to do something, I guess this is a good. If God calls you to do something and you think, yep, I've got this sorted out, I would suggest that. I'm trying to think of whether they're biblical principles. I suggest that God didn't call you to do that thing. If God calls you to do something, and the moment you hear what God has called you to do, you're ecstatic. You're over the moon. You're like, oh, thank God, finally, you have realized that I'm here. I would suggest that probably wasn't God. No. I'd think about it for a while, and very quickly, for those of you that know your Bibles, can you go through your Bibles and find me somebody who was happy the moment God called them? Somebody in the Bible who was ecstatic over the moon. Is it okay? Does everyone understand what I just said? Samuel. Someone says Samuel. Samuel. I said ecstatic. I think